Okay, let's pick up with the posterior or posterior pituitary gland. We already mentioned the two hormones that are produced or made by the hypothalamus are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. But they are not released directly from the hypothalamus. Instead, they are sent to the posterior pituitary. And then the posterior pituitary is going to be the gland that releases these hormones. Let's talk about what is antidiuretic hormone. Well, what it does when it is traveling through the bloodstream, it signals to the kidneys that to reclaim or reabsorb water, so to prevent dehydration. Now, an interesting thing about ADH is if you've ever known of someone who drinks alcohol frequently, or if you have and you notice how much you urinate, that's because alcohol actually negatively affects this hormone. And so it does. So even though the hormone may be being produced, the kidneys are not reabsorbing water and can lead to dehydration. Now, oxytocin is a hormone that causes the uterus to contract during childbirth. And an interesting thing about oxytocin is most hormones that we're going to talk about are regulated by something called negative feedback. And what that means is when a hormone is produced, when it reaches a certain level, it inhibits the gland from making more and more. So it keeps it at sort of a narrow range that's healthy, right? A homeostatic range. But oxytocin is not that way. It is under positive feedback. So in other words, the more oxytocin that's produced, the more that is produced, the more that is produced, the more that is produced until the child is born, and then that signals the inhibition of oxytocin. Okay, let's move to the anterior pituitary. And the hypothalamus is also controlling this gland in that it either sends a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone to the anterior pituitary for each of the hormones that the anterior pituitary makes and secretes. So I have listed for you here 6 hormones that are made by the anterior pituitary. So growth hormone, which obviously is about, cells dividing and growing. Prolactin is actually the hormone that causes milk letdown, milk production in breastfeeding mothers. Thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid to make its hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, which we'll talk about later, affects the adrenal glands and the production of their hormones. And then these last two, follicle stimulating hormone FSH or luteinizing hormone LH. And again, these have to do with our reproductive organs. And so when we get to the reproductive chapter, we'll learn more about these. But what I want you to see is the hypothalamus is either going to produce a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone for each one of these. So for example, if growth hormone should be released by the anterior pituitary, then the hypothalamus will send a growth hormone releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary, which signals, yes, you need to make and release growth hormone. However, if it shouldn't signal the release of growth hormone, the hypothalamus will send a growth hormone inhibiting hormone to the anterior pituitary, which says, no, don't make and secrete growth hormone. Now, you don't need to understand the details of this image over here to the right, but what I wanted you to see is if the hypothalamus says, yes, I'm going to send growth hormone releasing hormone. In other words, this is a hormone that signals to the anterior pituitary, yes, make and secrete growth hormone. Then we will see that we're going to see the effect of growth, right? Growth hormone is going to be released and it's going to circulate in the bloodstream. So we're going to get cell division. We're going to have growth in those areas. In order to do that, we're going to need energy. So the liver is going to release some glucose. Now, if in fact the hypothalamus says no, we're going to inhibit the release of growth hormone, then growth hormone will not be released from the anterior pituitary. So this process is the same for all of these hormones, right? If the hypothalamus says yes, release it, then it will be released from the anterior pituitary. If the hypothalamus says no, it inhibits the release, then those hormones would not be released by the anterior pituitary. The pineal gland, which we've mentioned the location, it plays a role in our circadian rhythms or our sleep cycle because the hormone it produces is melatonin. And you may be familiar with this because many people will recommend or take melatonin to help them if they have trouble with their sleep cycles. And this is thought to, if you wake up in the morning and you go outside and you see sunlight, that sunlight is thought to inhibit your melatonin production. And then if there's periods of darkness, like at night, then the melatonin production increases, which helps with the sleep cycles. Thyroid gland. So we see here, so here's our voice box, our larynx, just to get your bearings. And just below that, we would see the thyroid gland. The thyroid produces two important hormones that I will sort of refer to as T3 and T4. Both of these contain iodine. And T3 is thyroxine and T4 is triiodothyronine. These two are very important in metabolism of our cells. So in other words, if we have more T3 and T4, our metabolism of our cells or chemical reactions are going to increase. If we have less T3 and T4, the metabolism or the cell reactions are going to decrease. Now, I wanted to mention to you, if you've heard of hypothyroidism, hypo means less. So if you have less of those, you have lower metabolism. Hyperthyroidism means more, so you have more metabolic activity. If you have ever paid attention to salt at the store, you can buy iodized or non-iodized salt. Because both of these hormones contain iodine, we have to make sure we have enough iodine in our diet. And so iodine is added to salt in order to make sure we all have enough iodine in our diet. In some third world countries where people don't get enough iodine in their diet, they'll have these very large masses or growths around their thyroid on their neck called goiters because the thyroid is continuing to try to produce T3 and T4. However, there isn't enough iodine to do that. Now, another hormone made by the thyroid gland is calcitonin. And calcitonin reduces the amount of calcium that is circulating in the blood. We already know that calcium is important in muscle contraction and is important in bone growth. But we need calcium to be at a narrow range within our circulating blood. So we actually have a pair of hormones that control this so that we don't have too much or too little calcium. Calcitonin made by the thyroid gland reduces the levels of calcium in the blood. And it does that because it actually inhibits the type of cells that break down our bone, and those are called osteoclasts. Now, there is an antagonist or something that works opposite to calcitonin called parathyroid hormone, and so what it would do is it would increase the calcium levels in the blood. And here we see our parathyroid gland located right here on the thyroid gland. And as I mentioned to you, it makes a hormone called parathyroid hormone. It acts opposite to calcitonin by increasing or raising calcium levels in the blood. Okay, now let's move on to our adrenal glands. So first of all, I just want to remind you that the adrenal glands, there's a pair of them, and they sit on top of the kidneys. Now we look at the adrenal glands in two different regions. So the cortex, or the outer part of the adrenal gland, and then the inner part, which we call the medulla. The adrenal cortex makes two important types or classes of hormones. One is called mineralocorticoids, and this is very important in blood pressure and blood volume. An example of that would be aldosterone. Another class of important hormones are called the glucocorticoids, and these are important in lowering inflammation in our body, so they play a role in our stress management. Now, the medulla, or the inner part, has hormone production that you may be familiar with, so epinephrine and norepinephrine. So if you've taken psychology, you've probably heard of the fight or flight response, which is that immediate, right? You get you can feel your heart rate increase, your pupils dilate, your respiratory system, the trachea and those cells dilate so that you can get more air in. Those hormones are produced by the adrenal gland, the medulla part of the adrenal glands. Now let's talk about the pancreas. So we've already mentioned that it's both exocrine and endocrine. Exocrine because we know that it's releasing those digestive enzymes through a tube or a duct right into the small intestine, the part of the small intestine called the duodenum or the duodenum. But what we're focused on today is the endocrine part of the pancreas. And I mentioned to you that insulin was probably a hormone that you're familiar with. And insulin lowers the amount of sugar or glucose in our blood. Now, if you've heard of diabetes or if you know someone that's diabetic, you know that the insulin levels need to stay in a certain range, right? If they get too high or too low, it can be very problematic for people's health. So insulin lowers the blood sugar, and it does that because it's basically telling it's causing glucose to be stored away in the liver and in muscle cells. Now, because we need this glucose level to be a constant level, we have another hormone that acts in opposite to insulin called glucagon. Glucagon is also made by the pancreas, and so it's going to raise the blood sugar level. So it is going to then tell the liver to release glucose back into the bloodstream. Now, so if you think about after you've eaten a large meal and you have a lot of blood sugar circulating, insulin then is going to be what's released to cause that to be stored away. If you go for a period of time and you haven't had any input of glucose, then glucagon is going to be signaling the release of glucose from your liver and your muscle cells into your blood. Now, I mentioned to you ovaries and testes are endocrine glands because they make sex hormones, but we're going to talk about the details of these when we talk about our reproductive chapter. And the last thing I want to leave you with is I've mentioned several times that most hormones act by way of negative feedback so that there's not too much of that hormone being produced, so it's under control. Now, we mentioned a couple like oxytocin and prolactin that have positive feedback, but the majority of these hormones actually have negative feedback. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is when the hormone is produced, when the level of the hormone increases, it actually inhibits further production of that hormone. And then as the levels of the hormone drop, then more of the hormone can be produced. And so the overall goal of this is to maintain homeostasis, right? Or particular levels of things in the body. Now let's look at our thyroid hormones and see what does that mean exactly in this figure over here to the right. So let's say that our metabolic rate, remember, that's how much or how fast our chemical reactions are occurring in our cell, and those are regulated by T3 and T4, and these are made in the thyroid gland. Let's say that the metabolic rate gets too low. Okay, well, what that will say is the hypothalamus, remember, is under control of a lot of these. The hypothalamus will say, it's time to send a thyroid releasing hormone. And this triggers the pituitary then to release thyroid stimulating hormone. When that gets to the thyroid will say, okay, I will make both T3 and T4. And what's going to happen? Well, that's going to increase the metabolic rate of all cells. Because remember, those hormones are going to be circulating through the blood, right? Where they'll interact with any cell that has a receptor for T3 and T4. But if the metabolism then gets too high, the hypothalamus will stop making that thyroid releasing hormone, and the anterior pituitary will stop making the thyroid stimulating hormone, and then the thyroid will not be signaled to make T3 and T4. So those levels then will eventually drop. When they drop too low and metabolic rate goes down, then we start the process over again, right? Where more T3 and T4 will be produced. So I hope that what you can see based on this is the negative feedback helps to keep the hormone level in a certain range, not too high and not too low, which in turn affects the cells, right, that hormone is acting on. So I hope that's helpful.